When I was turning 10 is the summer that the very first two people walked on the moon. And I just thought, that's the coolest thing. And let me do that. I served as an astronaut for 21 years. And I was in space for 6 months. So that meant I spent 20 and a half years of training and preparation. My son suggested, hey, Dad, why don't you do a cover of David Bowie's Space Oddity? And Bowie loved my version of it, and friends put the other instrumentals underneath. But it's my voice and that space guitar up there. When you're an author, especially a fiction author, the characters and the ideas they're like your eternal companions, always there as voices in your head, traveling around with you.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Chris Hadfield has flown in 3 space missions. He served as commander for 5 months at the International Space Station. He was also the chief of robotics for the NASA Astronaut office in Houston. And prior to going into orbit, he was with the Canadian Armed Forces as an engineer and a fighter pilot. But as if that isn't accomplishment enough, he's a public speaker, educator, musician, and has released 2 books exploring the world of space fiction. Well, I had the opportunity to get him on Connected and started our conversation by asking him about SpaceX's 400th orbital flight. Commander Chris Hadfield, Colonel, astronaut, and author, thank you so much for being on the program. As I said, it was very difficult to know what to start with, as you've done so many things, and there's so many things I'd like to talk to you about. But let's start with SpaceX. It's just launched its 400th orbital flight. Can you give us a sense of what kind of a landmark this is?
Well, I think it's important to put landmarks into context. When I was born, no one had flown in space. All of this has happened just in one lifetime. And we've gone from something that was impossible to barely possible, but it took the wealth of one of the greatest nations on earth just to even allow that to happen at all, to now, where the technology has advanced so far, the safety levels have gotten so high that the cost has dropped down so low now that we have reusable spaceships, and a private individual can pay for a flight into space, whether for their payload, their satellite, or even for themselves. And that's an amazing change in a very short time. And the company that's leading the world in that is SpaceX. Just incredible what they've done in the last 20 years, and even more so, I think, in the last 5 years.
So that brings me to my next question. You took your last flight more than a decade ago. How different would it be now, commanding a flight?
Well, commanding the space station's the same. There are 7 people up on the space station right now, and one of them is the commander. The space station's been up there with people for 24 years now. We've had continuous human presence. So that's a real lovely stability, an amazing laboratory orbiting the world 16 times a day for a quarter of a century. But the vehicles that take you up and back have gotten significantly, simpler. So sort of like the difference maybe between some of those early airplanes where they were very dangerous, and it took all the incredible skill of the pilot just to barely even get those airplanes into the air and safely back on the ground. Now, airplanes are much more automated. The level of safety is so much higher, and people sort of take flight for granted. And we've gone through that evolution in spaceships. We're not there yet. It's still very complicated. Launch is still very dangerous. And it still takes a considerable amount of crew training to safely do it. But it's far simpler and less crew intensive than it used to be, which is great. You don't want to spend all of your time exploring space, just operating the ship. You're kind of going to miss what's happening. So it's a good progression. I'm amazed at how quickly it's happened, but I think I'm even more amazed at what's coming next, how quickly we're moving on and taking advantage of the technologies that we've developed.
And that's definitely something I want to talk about as we get through our questions today. But first, so is it something you'd like to do? Get back in the commander's seat?
I served as an astronaut for 21 years, and I was in space for 6 months. So that meant I spent 20 and a half years of training and preparation and spaceflight invention and spaceflight development and making spaceflight more possible and more capable. And to me, that's the really interesting part. The flight at the end is sort of the icing on the cake. So if you were to say to me, "Hey, do you want to go for a ride on a rocket ship?" I'd say, "Yeah, but I'm not that interested in going for a ride." To me, what's really interesting about it is pushing back the edge of what we don't understand, pushing back the edge of our own capability. And so if you said, "Hey, we want you to be part of a crew that's going to walk on the moon in 8 years, and you're going to have to work on it 7 days a week, 18 hours a day for the next 8 years. Do you want to do that?" That's what I would love to sign up for, because that's what essentially excites and thrills and challenges me about being an astronaut.
Speaking of human beings in space, let's talk about two of them who are in space currently. Boeing Starliner's astronauts Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore were launched on March 4th. They're still there. Can you explain their predicament?
Sunny and Butch. Sunny's terrific. They're both U.S. Navy combat veterans and test pilots. They worked and trained for that flight for years, multiple years. And then when they finally were going to fly in space, their flight was only 8 days long, minimum, maybe a little longer. And to take all of that risk of launch on a rocket ship that had never taken human beings before, a spaceship that has never carried human beings before, and have to come back after 8 days, it's like an enormous ripoff. So to get to the space station, be safely there, and then say, "Hey, you don't have to go back home in 8 days. You can stay. You can stay for an entire long duration increment." It's the greatest gift that you could give to an astronaut. It's like winning the ultimate lottery prize for an astronaut. So it's just been comical to see how wrong the media gets it. Describing astronauts as being stranded in space. Astronauts think people on Earth are stranded. They never get to leave. They're stranded in one place for their whole life. So it just makes me laugh.
A very different perspective. But does that mean that when a ship launches into space, there is always that contingency that it would be there much longer, perhaps, than originally planned? And in that case, then what does that mean, for the forward thinking and supply? They have to eat and oxygen and all those other things that you need to survive.
Sure, something like that happens on a pretty regular basis. And when you launch, you don't know when you're coming back. I mean, you could be coming back in an hour, or you could be coming back in one day, or you might come back close to the time you planned, or it might get delayed. It's not an airline; it's space exploration, so that's all fine. And so we build the spaceships, and obviously we build the space station so that it's not subject to like some rigid train schedule or something. There's vast reserves of everything that you need on the space station. There's there's a big clothing stores. So, and there's lots of food. There's, I don't know what, year and a half worth of food. And we recycle almost 100% of the water. We recycle the air. We'd have to bring up a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of water, but basically it's a really great, safe, long-term place for people to live off of the Earth. And so once you get there, you're at a safe haven. And so if someone stays 1 month or 3 months or 8 months, all that means is the longer they stay, the more work we get done up there, running the 200 experiments on board. So yeah, we're definitely ready for shifts in schedule.
I want to focus on your personal journey now. What is it that inspired you to want to be an astronaut?
I realized as a kid that you get one life and you have most of the control over it. The decisions that you make actually determine to a large degree what's going to happen with your life. What food do you eat? What studies do you follow? How do you keep yourself in shape? What do you learn? What risks do you take? Where do you live? Who do you go through life with? And when I was a kid, I thought, wow, I get one life and I get to make some of the choices. Well, why don't I choose to do the coolest thing that I could possibly imagine? And when I was a kid, it was when the very first astronauts were starting to fly, cosmonauts and astronauts. And when I was turning 10 is the summer that the very first two people walked on the moon. And I just thought, that's the coolest thing. And let me do that. And so I just started making choices at 10 years old. in order to give myself the greatest chance possible of doing the thing that I dreamed about the most. I realized the odds were terrible, that I probably would never fly in space. But why wouldn't, with your own life, why wouldn't you pursue the things that are most important to you, that you really dream of? But build yourself a life along the way that will support you and that you love. And so I became an engineer because I knew I could always get work as an engineer, and I find it interesting. I became a pilot, and then everybody should serve their country. I became a military pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Cold War. I was a combat fighter pilot, but then I still wanted to be an astronaut. So I got a couple university degrees. I went to test pilot school. I worked for years as a test pilot, not only with the Canadians, but with the US Air Force and the US Navy. And what I was doing was turning those 10-year-old dreams into a reality on a daily basis by making small decisions and doing things as well as I possibly could, and being relentless with trying to improve who I was and make the most of who I was. And so when I finally, one Saturday in May, when I got a phone call, and my wife was in the kitchen with me, and the phone call was from the president of the Canadian Space Agency saying, "Do you want to be one of Canada's astronauts?" It was as if I had been climbing this long slope my whole life, and suddenly I could peek over the other side and realize that this part of my dreams was going to come true. So, and I still feel the same way. I'm still fascinated by possibility and opportunity and trying to make good decisions on a daily basis that give me the greatest chance to accomplish the things I dream of.
What's the longest you spent in space?
I flew in space 3 times, twice on the space shuttle. First one was a little more than a week. Second one was about 2 weeks. Third one was just under half a year. So my third flight, when I flew on the Russian Soyuz and then lived on the space station and commanded the space station, that was my longest flight. And altogether, my 3 flights were just under 6 months, I think. So, but if you're in space for 6 months, that's 2,650 times around the world.
And was that when you made the first ever music video to be filmed in space with David Bowie's Space Oddity?
Yeah, it was during the long flight. The 2 short shuttle flights, there never would have been time to do that video. But during my third flight, the NASA psychiatrists put a guitar onto the space station, just like they put some books and they put music and stuff up there, because art is essential for mental health. And so there's a guitar up on the space station. It's been there since 2001. And I'm a musician and I write music. And my son suggested, "Hey, Dad, why don't you do a cover of David Bowie's Space Oddity?" And he said, "I'll update the words." And David Bowie loved my version of it. And friends put the other instrumentals underneath. But it's my voice and that space guitar up there. It's a Canadian guitar up on the space station. And it was just a fun project between my son and myself and a few musician friends. But David Bowie was very complimentary. He always wanted to fly in space. Even his last album, what was it, Dark Star, he was still dreaming about someday flying in space. So for me, maybe the best part, not just that you know about it and hundreds of millions of people have seen that video, but that it put a big smile on Mr. David Bowie's face in the last couple of years of his life.
That must have been quite gratifying. Playing the guitar is difficult enough. How difficult is it playing without gravity?
Guitars are designed for gravity. You don't normally see a person on stage without a guitar strap, because how would you hold the guitar up? So we wear a strap so the guitar stays in front of you. Or if you look at the bottom of the guitar, it's sort of shaped like an hourglass or a peanut. And that's because that curve is supposed to sit over your thigh. So it'll stay in place. So when you move your hand up and down the fretboard, the guitar will stay still. Well, if there's no gravity, then a strap doesn't help and it's not going to sit on your knee. And every time you move your hand, the guitar is flying all over the place. So if you watch me playing guitar carefully up on the space station, you'll see I pinch the guitar underneath my bicep against sort of that upper hard corner. So it doesn't affect the resonance of the guitar, but it holds it firmly in place so that it doesn't float away while I play.
You do like to give yourself a challenge, huh? Your creative pursuits continued as you came back down to Earth in the form of writing. You wrote The Apollo Murders and your latest, The Defector. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I've actually written 5 books. I write nonfiction, but you're right. The last two I've written have been thriller fiction, and they've done superbly well. I think The Apollo Murders is in like 15 languages, and it's being made into a television series by a production house. My most recent book, The Defector, was the number one selling book in Canada for quite a while last year of all the books in the country. So I'm just delighted that that as another kind of long held dream of mine and a challenge and a skill set that if I work at it hard enough. Today, I wrote almost 2,000 words of the next book in the series. Um, it's a fascinating way to try and push myself to learn things and to develop my own skills and to share my experiences with other people. And when you're an author, especially a fiction author, the characters and the ideas they're like your eternal companions, always there as voices in your head traveling around with you. So it's as if those characters in my fiction books are just sort of my eternal invisible companions in my head. And I just love the perpetual sort of second track going on of the plots of the stories and ideas that I know I'm going to be able to fold into the thriller fiction books. And I've got people all around the world because it's the same main characters who are like, okay, we're waiting on that third book. Come on, I want to know what happens to Kaz and Svetlana and JW and everybody. So to me, it's a really fun stage now to be writing internationally successful, best-selling thriller fiction.
And how much of your own experiences do you put in it, as far as what you were doing in space, or any kind of little idiosyncrasies that you might have come across while in space that you'd find in your characters?
I might be unique amongst all the fiction authors in the world in that I'm writing about space travel and spaceships and capsules and atmospheric reentry and rocket ships and docking and I've done all those things. I've actually have personal experience and I've lived in Russia for 5 years and I speak Russian passably. And so to write and lived in Star City, Russia, I flew a Russian rocket ship and so it gives me almost unmatchable inside sort of a feel of how it really is in order to get the books as factually correct as possible. And if you read my thriller fiction books, they're uh, probably 95% are real things that happen. Over half the characters are real people. And then I just weave my plot into, what just might have happened if history had unfolded slightly differently.
I do love a good thriller, I must say. So definitely on my list. Okay, so coming back to what is happening in the nonfiction world, let's take a look at what's happening in what's being called the space race. Usually despite political hostilities on Earth, space programs have a huge sense of collaboration between countries and different entities. Is that continuing, or can you see that continuing, given the way we're seeing the world? I feel the direction we're going.
Well, everybody wants to feel that the time that they're alive is the most important time in all of human history. And of course, it isn't. This is just my particular, whatever, 85 years. But I would really like it to be significant because it makes me feel more special. And that's normal. People always have felt that way. But you don't have to go very far back in history to have good parallels to what's going on now. When the space business began, it was the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and the United States were at Cold War with each other and threatened each other with thermonuclear arsenals. And the space business, space travel, everything was sort of because of that push for military technology. And yet, we found ways to take that military technology and turn it to extremely beneficial, peaceful purposes like weather observation and forecasting. So we know when a huge typhoon or hurricane is coming. For communication, so that you and I can so effortlessly talk to each other on different sides of the world. For navigation, I mean, think what GPS and the other navigation satellites do for us. And I was a combat fighter pilot during the Cold War, where the Soviets were my defined enemy. And yet, politics swings back and forth. Allegiances change. The Soviet Union was an ally in the Second World War, and so you can say, well, right now, things have never been this bad. Well, of course they've been worse than this. During the plague, or during the First World War, or the Second World War, or the Great Depression, or choose your moment in history. There have been wicked times and there have been great times, and these are just times. And what we need to do is find common purpose. We need to find ways to get past the current political pendulum, or the current people in charge of certain subsets of humanity, try and endure all of the human imperfections, and meanwhile do amazing things like live in peace with 15 nations on board an international space station for 25 years, or explore the moon, or to try and find if we're alone in the universe or not, or to build huge international projects like the Hubble telescope or the James Webb telescope. There's always going to be conflict. We're people, we're imperfect, but there's also always going to be beautiful and amazing and inspiring things happen. And my entire life, I have just worked hard to stay within the rules of all of the political pendulums, but at the same time, try and be part of exploration and peaceful cooperation and mutual benefit as much as I can. And that's still every single day the way I conduct my life.
Talking about mutual benefit and perhaps the next era in space travel, do you see it actually being viably commercial for people to take a holiday in space at some point?
Well, spaceflight's been commercial since the beginning. The lunar lander that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin flew down and landed on the surface of the moon, it was built for profit. It was built for profit by a commercial company, built by Grumman. And the space shuttle was built by Rockwell. And, it's always been commercial. Uh, but it was so expensive that the only customer had to be a superpower. But now, as the safety's gone up and the cost has come down, uh, now the customer doesn't just have to be a superpower. It can be just a smaller country, or a business, or even a person of means, and the cost is going to continue to come down. So it's normal. That's what we've been trying to do. Make it simple and safe enough that it's not just for superpowers. And it'll take a while. The technology's complicated, but think how it is right now, where you can just get on an airplane in Taipei and fly anywhere in the world, and it's expensive, but it's not unachievably expensive, and you can fly to almost anywhere in the world, really, with no real concern for safety, and you're going to get there, and you're going to be close to on time. And we've built this amazing system that almost would have seemed impossible 100 years ago. And so you need to sort of roll that forward to space travel. The technology is getting better. It's still expensive. It's still got a high level of danger, but it's getting better every single day. I take great pride in the fact that I've helped to contribute to that also by the space work that I did for 21 years with the space agency, and even now with the space companies that I'm working with.
So the next question is, what do we do when we get there? The US is set to reestablish a human presence on the moon for the first time since the Apollo 17 mission in 1972. NASA's crewed Artemis launch is expected to take place in 2025. What is the future you see at the moon base? What are they going to do there that will define the next era in space?
It's funny, in the 1600s, people said the same thing about Canada. And Voltaire said, in the comfort of France, and I'm going, hey, we've already got people here, and schools, and problems, and taxes, and why would we be concern ourselves with a few acres of rock and snow? And or 150 years ago about Antarctica. Like, why would anybody ever go to Antarctica? And it was dangerous, and people died, and Shackleton and his crew almost died, and now thousands of people live in Antarctica. Uh, And so I think if you're trying to get a feel for what's liable to happen on the moon in the next 50 years, have a look at what's happened in Antarctica over the last 100 years. As the technology suddenly got safe and good enough for people to get there, then it becomes just another place that people can live. And it becomes a really interesting scientific outpost. And it becomes a place to understand our world better. And the moon is going to be quite a bit like that as a Earth Moon system. There's a difference maybe to the moon, though, in that the moon has no life. It is completely lifeless. There's no biosphere to disrupt. There is no impact to some sort of life form. So it makes the moon more of a mineral resource. And if you laid the moon out on the Earth, it would be bigger than Africa, and Africa is a huge continent. And so to think that we've basically now just started to build the machines that will let us readily not just sort of explore, but actually start to settle on a continent bigger than Africa that is completely untapped, almost unsurveyed. We've literally just scratched the surface in a few places. So we'll send robots. We'll start to send people, and we've discovered there are vast reserves of water on the moon, which is great because that's one of the main needs of life and of human life. And you have eternal solar power at the poles, so you got power and water. And so I think over the next 20 years, you'll see just early exploratory landings with robots and then people, and then starting to stay longer and longer and stay in the places that are most friendly to human life as we begin to survey and understand the moon and see what makes sense for it to be brought into an Earth Moon system from a scientific point of view, maybe from a business point of view, maybe from just a human, one more place that people live kind of point of view. And all of those things were right now at that moment in history where they're unfolding.
We've just run out of time, your time, Commander, but I would like to just draw on your goodwill to just ask you one question about something that you've spoken a lot about, and that is going to be a big concern, and that is the increase in satellite deployments, which we've seen grow exponentially, especially with large constellations like the Starlink project. How close do you think we are to a scenario like the Kessler syndrome, where collisions could lead to dangerous cascades of debris out in space?
Yeah, if you just launch one satellite like Sputnik, then you know it's a pretty low threat. But if you launch two, eventually they might run into each other. If you launch 10,000, then of course there's a much higher probability of things running into each other. And if you don't think about it, if you just sort of callously do it, then your old rocket bodies are going to be up there and bits are going to fall off your spaceship. And you're going to have sort of a cloud of things orbiting the world that become a hazard. You know, it's like hail in the wind or dust in the wind. And we're capable enough now of launching things into space that we need to take responsibility for our own actions. And so we are. United States is leading global regulation on it, but you can't launch a satellite unless it has a defined entire life and a plan to deorbit it at the end. And it has to have the ability to maneuver, so it's not going to crash into another vehicle and cause debris. A few of the leading nations of the world have tested anti-satellite weapons, where you go up there and blow up something next to a satellite, you know, a military satellite, to destroy it. But that turns one or two pieces into thousands of pieces, which really contributes to the orbital debris problem. So we need to stop having anti-satellite weapons. It's dumb. It's self-destructive. And there's lots of countries have signed along with a moratorium on that. So we need to stop making the problem worse by having rules on satellites that launch and controlling anti-satellite weapons. And we need to be able to know where everything is so that they don't run into each other. And there's a lot of people working on that. And we need to be able to clean it up. And there's a lot of different organizations, companies, and governments that are developing the technologies and the rules to try and clean up the debris. It's sort of like plastics in the ocean. You know, whose problem is that? Everybody contributes. but who's actually going to take responsibility? And it's interesting that one person from Europe, a guy named Boyan Slat, just decided, hey, I'm going to be that guy. And he's collecting thousands and thousands of tons of plastic out of the ocean just because he decided it's the right thing to do. And we need to extrapolate that up and clean up the mess that we've been making in orbit. It's a problem. It's not as dire as sometimes it's made out to be in the media. But it's definitely a serious problem. We need to take it seriously, and we need to take responsibility for it.
And finally, my last question to you, as someone who has seen space up close, what is the future of space exploration you would like to see?
I think we should try and do everything for the betterment of a sustainable world for ourselves and all the other species on our planet. You know, when there were only a million human beings, you could kind of do whatever you wanted because the world was big and it could absorb it. But we're at 8.2 billion human beings right now, and everybody flushes the toilet and turns the lights on and creates some sort of carbon dioxide every day. And if you look at birth and death rates, we're going to be about 10 billion human beings. And so, how can we develop the technologies and the societal structures that we need in order to provide a good quality of life in a sustainable way for 10 billion people? To me, that is the future that I work towards. It's why I work with all sorts of different technology companies. It's why I help run a big international technology incubator. It's why I speak all around the world. It's why I'm talking to you. It's not going to happen accidentally. We need people to decide this is a worthwhile goal, and we need to push the technologies that allow us to solve those big problems. And lots of countries and companies and individuals are working on it, self-included. And to me, space, there's nothing magic about it. It's like saying, you know, this high off the ground or this high off the ground. They're both just somewhere else that people are, and we need to use the advantages that space gives us of understanding the health of the world, of providing us with resources and communication, and fold that into the future that we all want to have together. And it's got to be technologically supported, and it's got to be human accepted. And it's always going to be imperfect. But we've been around for 300,000 years, and it's never been easy. It's always been an existential risk. And we've managed to muddle through somehow for all of this time. So I'm not Chicken Little. I don't think the sky is falling. But at the same time, it's a serious business, and everybody needs to recognize that they have a part to play.
And that was Chris Hadfield, retired colonel, astronaut, and author, joining us from Tampa, Florida in the US. Thank you for watching the show. It has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.